Welcome everyone. This session is called Decentralized Identity in Practice. I'll be your host and moderator for this session. And today we're joined by three pretty well-known decentralized identity experts, and we'll get the opportunity to let them introduce themselves very soon. A kind of personal intro to me. So I'm Nick Lambert. I'm the CEO of Doc. I've been working in the decentralized identity space for about 4 years. And prior to that, I've been involved in decentralized technology generally relating to things like decentralized storage since late 2011, early 2012. So I'm definitely a glutton for punishment, but love the notion of individuals being able to control their own information, whether that's identity or music files or anything else. And so by the end of this session, everyone attending, we'd like you to have a really good base of understanding of decentralized identity technology, the business benefits it can offer, and also how it can be applied, so that maybe we'll touch on some of the different use cases that we see it being applied and where it could be applied. This session is scheduled to last for 1 hour. So it's currently 5 p.m. UK, it lasts until 6, and probably spend about 45 minutes running through some kind of topics with everyone, the panelists on this call. During that time, if you have questions that you think are unusual or we're just not answering for you, then please feel free to put them into either Riverside or into LinkedIn Live, and we'll try and pick out the questions that are most topical or we think are good questions, and we'll try and pick those off towards the end. For anyone that's signed up by email, we will share the recording, like I say, after a few days. And so, yeah, don't feel the need to scrabble down notes. We'll send you the whole session so you have it. Final thing from me before we get started. I think the expectation before the event was that most people would know what decentralized identity was, but Emma I think rightfully pointed out that might not be the case. And so as a kind of precursor for this session, decentralized identity has kind of been defined in many different ways, but we can think of it as a way to identify yourself or an organization online without needing to rely upon a central organization or entity. So typically a government or a kind of large corporation is the way it typically would work today with non-decentralized identity. And one of the great things about this technology, it enables users to have full control over what they're sharing, and who's verifying that information of their personal identity data. An important point here is identity doesn't necessarily just mean a government issued identity. Sometimes we just think it's all about passports or driver's licenses, but actually it could be any identifier that's used online. It could be an email address or a username and a password. So important to think more broadly in terms of what identity or identifiers are. And another great thing about this technology is it's in a digital format, so we don't have to take pictures of it. It's already digital, and it cannot be tampered with, duplicated, or stolen. And so those are some of the reasons why many of us are so excited about the possibilities that exist. So without further ado, we'll get started. But if we could go around the panelists, starting with you, Emma, then Nick, then James, and just if you could give a brief introduction to yourself, please.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Nick. Delighted to be here. Thanks for the invite, and excited to be on the panel with James and Nick. So my name is Emma Lindley. I am co-founder of an organisation called Women in Identity, and I'm also managing director of a company called CAF, headquartered out of Brazil. I've been in the identity industry for over 20 years now. I was at a company called GB Group Joined them in 2003 and was part of the team that built the UK's first identity proofing system with a set of APIs, which all sounds very kind of basic and rudimentary now, but it was pretty fancy at the time. Obviously, having been in the space for 20 years, I've kind of lived and breathed the journey that identity's gone through federated, and then obviously through to looking at decentralized technologies and decentralized identity. So yeah, delighted to be here.
Thanks, Emma.
Nick, thanks very much for having us. My name is Nick Riss. I'm the co-founder of a company called Mission. I come to where we're at today 7 years into the decentralized identity journey, to some extent building off the shoulders of people like Emma who've been fighting the good digital identity fight for 20 plus years. And we came along and, we've done this cool thing, self-sovereign identity, decentralized identity, thinking there'd be this revolution instantly and everything would be, materially changed. And it hasn't quite gone that way. But, fast forward 7 years later, and we're in a markedly different place. And I'm super excited about the amount of things that are going on right now. So this webinar is great place to discuss that.
Excellent. Thank you, Nick.
And hello, everybody. My name is James Monaghan. I, like a lot of folks, got into digital identity as a bit of a side quest. I thought I'd solve some other problem and discovered an identity problem that was in my way. And yeah, I mean, that was over a dozen years ago now. So you can see how it sucks some of us in. But initially, I was working at a company called Telesign that was building centralized identity based around phone numbers. Those are amazing because you can remember them and you can tell them to someone, and it's got a built-in authentication channel. So we thought that was going to be the answer to everybody's digital identity. Most of the people listening can imagine why you might not want your phone number as your one true digital identity now, but it seemed like a good idea at the time. I went on to join Evonym just as they were getting started, and Evonym was one of the pioneers of decentralized identity. And it was there that I really got the bug for figuring out that actually, if you put the user at the center of their digital interactions and store all the data with them, then you can look at lots of identity problems in a whole new way. And it was an incredibly exciting journey. Nick obviously was a part of that journey for a number of years. I left a couple of years ago, and since then have been working as a consultant and venture builder on various different identity ventures.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you for that, James. So you can see why we picked you all. You've all got really great backgrounds and some of the kind of OGs from the identity space. We covered a little bit in the intro there just about what decentralized, how it can be defined. One of the key aspects of identity is obviously its use for verifying information. So proving that we should have access to a system or who we are, so we can operate a piece of machinery or educate someone. How do you see, Emma, if I could direct this first question to yourself, how do you see decentralized identity technology impacting that component, the identity verification landscape?
So I think it's a great question, and I think it's a good starting point. I think one of the things that I see people talk about and kind of conflate, so I want to separate the two things, is the idea of reusable identity, digital identity, and decentralized identity, because when we think about identities in the way that generally they're done today, so I'll just describe that for a moment. You've got lots of different kind of like silos. So, if I open a bank account today with Santander, I have to go through a process to prove my identity. I then get a set of credentials to be able to then access Santander. If I want to open an account with Barclays tomorrow, I have to go through the same process again. It's inefficient. I'm having to leave my data in lots of places, and that's not a great thing. When we think about, the way that the identity market has moved towards kind of reusable identity. And that is the idea where you can have an identity set of credentials and kind of like that might just say, let's say it's username and password, and you might be able to reuse those across different areas. So, for example, if it was a reusable digital identity, I wouldn't then need to go through that KYC process and prove my identity again with Santander and Barclays, I might be able to use those set of credentials to be able to access both of those banks, for example. Saves costs, saves time, it's better user experience, generally kind of better for the market. Decentralization is something different again, because you can have reusable identity and you can have those benefits, but through a centralized model. And we see examples of that in like China and India, where they've got kind of the reusable digital identity, and yet it's still a central authority that has the authority over all of that data, and it's in perhaps a centralized part. The benefits of decentralization is that it essentially, reduces the threat vector from, things like data breaches or a central authority having access to that data and doing whatever they might want to do with it, whether they want to access it for, nefarious purposes, whether they just want to misuse it, and allow other people to have access to that data where they shouldn't do. So the decentralization really allows, the reduction of threat vectors, whether that be from, a data breach or, an external actor, or that central authority using that data in a way that is neither right or appropriate or thinks about the privacy concerns of the individual. So that's kind of how I think about it. But you can still have those reusable identities and get those benefits through a central authority.
Yeah, thanks for the clarification. I think that's a really good one to pick apart the difference between reusable and decentralized ID, because quite often they are confused. So yeah, thanks for that clarification. James, what are your thoughts on that?
To be honest, I often use those terms somewhat interchangeably, because I think if you imagine the continuum from centralized through federated and decentralized, and then with self-sovereign at the extreme angle, there are relatively few people today who advocate for either truly self-sovereign, like I am, who I say I am, and I don't need recourse to any other official authority to do so. Just as it is increasingly not the case in most societies where people want just one central authority on who someone is. So that middle ground is the really interesting part. And exactly as Emma said, like a lot of the benefits accrue from the reusability aspect. And it's only when you peek under the hood and say, well, what is it that we need in order to make reusability possible? That's when you start to come across things like decentralization and new kinds of cryptography, zero knowledge proofs, blockchains, all this kind of stuff. Because actually, if you really want something that is portable between contexts, then you've got to start solving for all those second order problems. But it really does come down to portability for me.
Thank you. Yeah, what are your thoughts, Nick?
I'm glad we're not fighting the fight about self-sovereign identity anymore. I think what Emma and James have spoken to some extent is the sheer number of dependencies and variables and things that need to be true. The blessing and the curse of decentralized identity is you can take your portable ID and data with you. The curse is that you can take it anywhere. And so what are the rails for making that happen? And I think we've moved beyond this point where people were busy trying to understand if the technology worked, and now we need to look at, how do you actually digitalize a business? How do you actually manifest these decentralized identities in a way that actually allows people to get value from them and move them around? And I think that's part of the reason that we haven't seen this proliferation of use cases yet. I think we're on the precipice of that, but we haven't got to that point.
Yeah, that's a good point. I was actually kind of reminded, I was reading something before I came on, and it was I forget what it was, but it was really good the way to put it. It said like decentralization is not the goal, and quite often I think sometimes people within the industry can fall in love with the fact it's decentralized, and of course that's not really the purpose. The purpose is, like you said, Emma, to get the greater privacy and security, or to get the convenience and the better user experience. It's not just to make it decentralized for the sake of it. So I think the other thing to think about when we think about decentralized is we're in this, or we should be in this for the benefits, not just to make it, something that, is decentralized just for the sake of it. So one of the great reasons for you guys coming on is that you've all worked in this space with companies for quite a long time in many cases, and lots of different types of companies. And I'm curious to understand and pick at those a little bit more. For example, James, we also work with you at Doc as well. And so in your travels, the types of companies that you're working with, what value do you think they're expecting to get from decentralized identity technology? What do you think, or what do they expect it to do for them?
Yeah, I mean, thankfully, it has changed from, if you'd asked me that question 3 or 4 years ago, it probably was, oh, well, we've got some blockchain budget and we've got to go spend it on doing a use case. And decentralization might have actually been the thing. Now it's actually much more widely understood what the sort of benefits that you can get from it are. And, a lot of times they're a little bit unromantic. They can be just saving cost, right? Like if you can reuse data that someone else has taken the time and effort to make verifiable for you, then that's going to be cheaper because you don't have to go to the same length to do that yourself. Now, what that unlocks perhaps is a streamlined user experience, right? You can get rid of long and cumbersome sign-up forms or checkout forms where you have to do really egregious things like take pictures of your driver's license and take selfies and so on and so forth. In a world where you can only do that once and then reuse it, you can have really magical, like new user experiences that are possible. But sometimes it is either cost or what comes up quite frequently as well is fraud and reducing the associated risk, right? So typically the data that we talk about is in the form of verifiable digital credentials, and these contain digital signatures, which means that you know the source and integrity of that data. And typically you also know who the holder is because there's some kind of binding there. And what that means is you're dealing with high assurance data as part of these customer experiences, not just reusable data in the same way that I could photocopy something completely made up, like the McLovin driver's license from Superbad. This is about verifiable data, which is what actually enables all this. And so if you can do that, then you start getting into, well, maybe I can grow revenue, right? And so there are some organizations amongst the more progressive ones that are thinking, well, this was a cost to me, right? I've gone and built this beautiful silo of customer data. Maybe this can be monetized with the customer's permission in a way that wouldn't otherwise be possible. This data would just languish in a silo, not helping me and not helping my customer. Maybe there are new opportunities that by enabling the portability of this data can unlock new business models, and with that perhaps even whole new use cases. So it really is a bit of a range, but the good news is these days the conversation is much more grounded in business realities and actually making a difference for users rather than kind of innovation theatre, and so that's why it's such an exciting place to be a practitioner.
Yeah, fantastic. James or Nick, do you guys want to come in on that as well in terms of kind of the value that companies are seeing from this technology?
Nick, I think there are three things that are driving enterprises and organizations now and the value they're going to derive from that. One is top of mind, particularly is regulation, right, and policy. So the EU policy, an organization adopting decentralized identity could be adhering to policy, right? And we're seeing the spread of policy above and beyond the EU, right? It obviously influences other parts of the world. You've got an answer to the impending or sort of evolving threat of AI, where fraud has just materially got worse, and it's going to get a lot worse. And then you've got this, probably the third pillar, which is consumer sentiment, right? How do you address the fact that people do not want to be treated as a product anymore? All the ills of Web 2, they don't want that anymore. So they want a different relationship with organizations, and they wanted their personhood to be treated differently. And an organization can now, by introducing this new paradigm, can they create value for themselves and their customers by doing that?
Yeah. So it's almost like the value there, Nick, is the proof of human, for example, within the AI use case.
Exactly.
Yeah, I'd agree with everything that Nick said, though. I think the other thing that I would probably just add is, I think the other kind of like motivating factor for organizations is the threat of like Apple or Google or, some of the kind of the big tech actors, which obviously has been driving a lot of the regulation from Europe. And I think, you talk to organizations like banks, for example, they're like, well, what's the future business model to kind of stop the impending kind of issues around, potential for these organizations to come along eat our dinner before we have a chance to do it ourselves.
Yeah, very much so. That's a good point, Emma, because we'll actually get into the kind of the revenue and the business model parts of identity shortly as well. So it's a good one to flag up. Looking at these value propositions and how companies are using technology, Nick, if I could come to you, what kind of production use cases? So I think you've alluded to it a couple of times, and we've all seen it in the industry where I think we all thought there'd be this avalanche of use all over the place, mass scale adoption, and it's not quite worked out that way, albeit that I think certainly we're starting to see a kind of lot of kind of green shoots of things really starting to happen, and certainly a few production use cases. What are ones that you're aware of, Nick, that are particularly exciting to you?
Yeah, you're right, Nick. It would be remiss of us not to address the fact that we're not all out there with decentralized identities and decentralized data right now. Look, for me, it's what is not clear to, I would say, the majority of organizations is that there is a lot of stuff happening just below the waterline. And there is a lot of noise going on. So being able to understand what signal from noise is I think, quite important as you're an organization thinking about the level of investment you're going to make in this new technology. For me, I come back to EU, right? I come back to a driver policy. I come back to a huge ecosystem of organizations coalescing around this problem. There's the European Union Digital Identity Wallet project that has dozens of organizations involved, covering 11 or 12 different use cases across 4 different bids or 4 different projects. I think that, for me, is probably top of mind when I think about utility. To some extent, it solves the bootstrapping problem as well, right? KYC gets a lot of airtime because obviously it's going to save a lot of money for the banks, but it's kind of a crap user experience. It's already solved, and I only do it once every 5 or 10 years. It's not where this is going to get started, but where you have policy mandating that a government body has to issue digital identities and they have to be accepted, then you've got the start of something that can become an ecosystem. And look, governments elsewhere, BC Gov, New South Wales awarded the biggest contract that's been awarded to anyone, I think, in this space. Bhutan, little tiny Bhutan, 800,000 people, the kingdom, they literally measure themselves on gross national happiness. And as part of that, they're using empowering decentralized identity capabilities to give their citizens and visitors a better way to engage and interact with the kingdom. And what I particularly love about those guys is they've borrowed thinking, and they've borrowed open source code base from BC Gov, who took it from Hyperledger. And we're starting, in terms of under the water level, I've spoken to 3 or 4 other jurisdictions in the last month who are modeling what they're doing on Bhutan, who borrowed from BC Gov, who borrowed from the fact that BC Gov has been progressive for 25 years on digital identity. So there's a lot going on. And that's not to say I don't like KYC as a use case. I just think those ones are going to, banks are going to be net beneficiaries when people have a bunch of digital provable data on their devices.
I actually quite like it. I know you're kind of dissing it, and I think it's quite a good use case, that KYC, because something like I would find that you'd use it quite frequently. Like if you're going onto different platforms, I think it's such a pain to have to go through that stuff over and over again. But it's probably not super exciting. I do get that part, but I find it like really convenient if it works.
Actually, Nick, you make a good point though, because it depends on the utility, right? If you're out there, digital currencies, for example, then I think there are more applications for KYC. And one of the things I'd actually say I'm really encouraged by is when you see these, particularly Web3 projects, and they're just using DIDs, and they're just using verifiable credentials like it's no big deal. Like they've been around for a dozen years, and it's just a fait accompli that they're going to become a reality. And we're like, that's really cool. Like, wow, good for you. So we're seeing those things pop up more and more, and I think that's great. That's what we need it to be.
Yeah. Any production use cases exciting you, Emma?
I mean, I think Nick's covered most of them, to be honest with you.
He's got a lot of them.
Yeah, he has. I'm trying to think of any others. We talked about some of the kind of nations doing it. I think, there's I mean, 20 years in the identity industry, I would say we are starting to see a real, like, genuine move, because decentralized identity in a concept is not itself is not new. It's probably like a 15-year-old, 17-year-old concept of of wanting to move towards decentralization. I think what we are starting to see now is real pockets of it happening, and I think that's exciting and interesting. And I think for everybody that's been involved, it's just these things always take longer than you expect them to take.
Yeah, absolutely.
I've got some.
Yeah, go for it, Jane. I was going to come to you. Please go for it, James. There was actually a question that was in the chat as well, James. So it'd be great if you can pick that one off, because two birds with one stone.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Well, so I'll look at that up in a second. But yeah, the couple of my favourites. So there's and they've got some things in common actually. But one of them was this was back during the Evenym days, but it's still live. There's a little company called True that was founded by a couple of doctors who wanted to solve the issue that when a doctor goes to work at a different hospital, they have to show up usually at least a day before the first shift that they have to work with paper copies of their passport, their degree certificate, various other qualifications and licenses they have, so that these can be manually inspected and verified against records, and GMC numbers can be checked and all this kind of stuff, to make sure they're a real doctor. Fair enough. But this has to happen before they can actually practice. And, junior doctors, they change hospitals, 6 times a year. And the NHS is sufficiently short-staffed that it's very, very, very common for doctors to need to go and fill in hospitals at other shifts. And so what True and another group of companies worked with the NHS to do was develop a digital staff passport that took all those different aspects of someone's identity, their government-issued ID, their academic qualifications, their professional qualifications, certifications, work history, etc. Each one of those was a verifiable credential, either from the authoritative source or from the HR department of the hospital where they were employed. That would live in a wallet that the doctor could then show up at Hospital B, have it instantly verified and shared with the HR team there. And they could do this 10 minutes before the start of their first shift. And this has the potential to save hundreds of thousands of clinical hours every single year. Which not just saves people time and hospitals money, but has a real potential to impact patient outcomes as well. So I love that use case, and I talk about it whenever I get a chance, which makes me sound like a bit of a stuck record. But the one that's similar to that I'm actually working on at the moment is in the volunteering sector. So completely different, but similar in a way, because they have the same category of problem, which is if you are someone who volunteers and you work with charity A, they have a responsibility to make sure that you are a real and responsible person. They might need to do a background check on you. They might need to give you some training or prove that you've had that training, and so on and so forth. So again, there's a number of checks that need to happen, which are time consuming for the volunteer, expensive for the charity, and just inconvenient, and overall tamp down participation in the volunteering sector. And if you want to go to volunteer for charity B, you have to do the same thing all over again. And so again, a volunteering passport that allows verifiable data from a group of trusted sources to be exchanged with the volunteer themselves in the middle, rather than some central platform, unlocks all of that wastage, all of that repetition and inefficiency in the system. And so this is a common thread through so many use cases that I think have a lot of potential, which is we're not decentralizing all the things. We're finding the specific pain point that can be unlocked either because of verifiable data, or because it's portable data, or because of greater privacy, or so on and so forth. So I absolutely love those.
Great.
But just that riffing on that point about True in particular, one of the beautiful things about that use case is you had a somewhat suppressed number of variables and dependencies, in as much as you didn't need some crazy governance framework that the whole world needed to sign up to acknowledge and accept these credentials. The other thing you had that was really important, that people really, really, really underlook, is the value to all of the constituent parts, right? The issue of the whole of the verifier. And in that example, you got to this equilibrium of value really quickly, to the point that everyone in that ecosystem was delighted by this new way of doing things. And that was what you needed to create that sort of that momentum.
And you have to, right? If otherwise you're the hammer looking for nails, right? Oh, I've got some data. Let me go see if someone wants it. Or I've got verifiable credentials. Isn't that cool? I really think that this stuff will reach its breakout moment when identity people stop talking about it, and people in industry just think of this as a tool in their toolbox. Honestly, portable high fidelity data is a thing, and you can use it now to go solve loads of problems. Off you go. That's what really excites me. So that question in the chat. So the question was, can anyone point out a real life full SSI use case and how the link between SSI and a physical person is established? So hopefully those are real decentralized identity use cases I mentioned. They're not SSI in the sense that there were in both of those ecosystems some roots of trust that all the participants agreed to trust, right? And so in the volunteering ecosystem, for example, you need a DBS check. There's a standard way in the United Kingdom of getting a background check for someone. You have to get it from one of the authorized providers. You can't just show up and say, I've got a DBS check that was witnessed by, the mayor of my town. Like that's not good enough. And so it's not self-sovereign identity in the way that crypto libertarians think about it, but it is decentralized and portable identity in that way. And I think most of the ones in production that are outside the crypto set of use cases have those properties in common. And as to how the link between the identity itself and the physical person, at the moment, that is usually down to the wallet itself. There are various standards in various stages of maturity for how you might do binding to the individual on a per credential basis. But I think it's safe to say that there isn't a universally accepted way of doing that yet. And so in both those ecosystems, the way it's expected to work is that you have a trust framework essentially that says, well, these credential issuers took these steps to verify the human before they issued the credential. And because we know what type of wallet was used, we know that it doesn't let you just, take the keys out and give it to your friend who's going to pretend to be a doctor and work your shift for you. It's actually going to maintain that binding both to your hardware, but then also to a biometric match that might be done at the moment that you show up in the HR department and do your enrollment. So typically you have to layer in those sorts of things around the edges as well.
Great, thank you for that. And good to pick off some of these questions as we go. Emma, can I come back to you? And I think we've mentioned a couple of times during this session that adoption hasn't maybe gone as quick as maybe people would have hoped for or anticipated. I think some of that could be down to possibly the business model of decentralized identity being not straightforward. So at least that's my opinion anyway. What's the motivation for a company to start issuing these credentials if they're not benefiting by verifying them? So I think that can be attributed to some of the slow adoption rates. What are your thoughts about that? And then also, what are you seeing as kind of revenues and business models that can be adopted around, for companies who are thinking about adopting and using decentralized identity?
So I think it's a good follow-on question to the conversation we've just been having, because I think when kind of decentralized identity started to come into the fore, it was problematic that it was just the identity community talking about it, because everyone was sort of like, oh, it's this amazing technology and people are just going to start using it because it's decentralized. And, I can remember being back in the day, I was like, well, who's going to pay for this? And how are the incentives going to work? And because that's the only way that you could start to get adoption. Like, where's the value in actually making this happen? And I think we're starting to get there with some of the use cases. Both Nick and James kind of eloquently described some of the use cases, and I think some of it is just starting small and really working out what the value is, because identity in itself, I'm going to say something quite contentious, although people are kind of like, oh, it's really sexy and exciting, it's not valuable unless you can go and do something with it. Right? So, everyone's going, oh, digital identity, it's so sexy and exciting. And I'm like, but what can you do with that digital identity? Because unless you can actually use it to go and do something, like people are not buying digital identity, they're buying outcomes, right? They're buying things that they can go and do easier. And I think for a long time, the identity community's been in this kind of romantic idea of going, I know, but it's digital identity. Surely everybody wants one. Well, not unless they can go and do something, not unless it's going to make it quicker or faster or cheaper or whatever it is. So that's really where I think we're starting to get to with some of these use cases, which I think is so powerful. That this is really where we are going to start to see the adoption. Some of those things could be, perhaps the relying party is paying for when the credential is used. That could be a transactional basis. It could be an annual basis. There are some models that I've seen where the end user pays. And I'd love to get Nick and James's view on like end user paying for, buying a wallet and having a wallet. Because again, I'm kind of skeptical about those models, because the way that the market works at the moment, is that the market pays rather than the user paying, like the organizations pay rather than users pays. I think, when thinking about these models, you really have to think about how are you going to incentivize those organizations that hold the authoritative data, who might be issuing the credentials. How are you going to incentivize them to do that? And again, I speak to businesses and they're like, well, we're just going to reuse this data. And I'm like, well, what does the data issuer or the data holder think of that? And then they're like, oh, well, they'll just never know. And I'm like, I'm pretty sure that's not a sustainable business model. So I think it's really thinking about what value we're delivering to the user, how we're going to incentivize the organizations that have the authoritative data and are perhaps going to be issuing these credentials. How are we going to incentivize that? And that might be the use case itself, because they might get something back for it, or it might be we have to give them some money, so generate some money from the use of those credentials. We give that back to the data issuer itself. So, but I think we're starting to get there with some of the business models. I think I'm going to make one last point, and I'll be really interested to kind of like what Nick and James think about this. But also you have to make the models sustainable, but you also have to make them ethical. There are some examples out there where organizations perhaps are paying individuals in countries where, perhaps they don't have a lot of money, and they're paying them in crypto to then give them perhaps their biometrics or something like that. And in my mind, that's not an ethical way to actually get data off individuals. So, understand that you have to have the data in the system to kind of make it work and be able to reuse. But then going into some of these markets and doing that in a way that, in my opinion, is not ethical, you really have to think about the ways ethically that you're collecting that data. But Nick, James, I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
I think it depends on the data you're talking about, right? I think if you're talking about government issued ID credentials on a jurisdiction by jurisdiction basis, governments are going to choose what they want to do with that, right? In the US, everything gets charged. So I fully expect that when I renew my driving license, it'll be, it wouldn't be out of the bounds of normal to have, okay, well, it's $45 for your physical one and $10 for your digital. There you go. And I don't think the market should underwrite the cost of that. And I don't think we should twist ourselves around saying, we're going to charge you a bunch of money for this digital identity. No. That's my digital identity issued by the government, or the government's ID issued to me. Either way, that's one use case. I think where organizations are adding real value, like I've done a background check on you, I've gone above and beyond, I can see different use cases for monetized credentials, for example. The one thing that I think organizations need to be very clear on is that they should not be waiting to determine a commercial model before they get started. If they wait, they will be too late. And honestly, if you're out there and your business, this is happening, right? Data is moving to the edge. Span of control is moving to the edge and to the consumer. If as a business, you cannot find a way forward and a commercial model, then you've probably got some bigger issues.
Well, and your data might not be that valuable in the first case. Right?
Exactly.
There was that whole data is the new oil fallacy, but maybe the answer isn't just turn around and try and sell it. I don't know. I mean, look, people pay for passports, for birth certificates, for driver's licenses, right? So for certain documents, there is an established model where the user pays. So to Emma's question, I don't think it's outrageous to imagine that, as part of the fee for getting your passport or your driver's license or your ID card, if you live in a country that has those, that some portion of that cost goes to funding a digital equivalent. And furthermore, I think viewed as a piece of digital public infrastructure, it makes complete sense for the government to do that, but essentially subsidize it, because think of the cost that you take out of the economy, not just for government use cases, verifying who people are, but then sucking all that fraud and inefficiency out of the financial sector, for example. It's a meaningful percentage of GDP, financial crime is, and lost productivity due to proving who you are. Like when you add that up, there's this often cited McKinsey study that talks about the percentage of GDP in lots of different economies that could be unlocked by having a robust digital identity. And all of that, ultimately is a case for the public sector stepping in and saying, yeah, like maybe the user chips in a bit, but like actually this we should just fund. But then you've got the rest of it, right? That's for your sort of government issued part. But what about your university degree? What about your certification for having gone and got a particular qualification or a particular piece of training, or for being a super fan of a particular crypto project or what have you? And I would argue that making those things available to the user in the most high leverage format possible, whatever that is just good marketing, right? Why would I go to a school that made it harder to prove that I got a qualification when there's so much competition out there for training providers and things like that? I want to go to the one that is going to be widely recognized by employers, where they're not going to have to worry about credential fraud and things like that, right? I think that sort of thing will apply in lots and lots of businesses where there is a strong incentive for them to make this data available. Again, whether or not they charge for it directly, it's part of their initial and existing business model, not a whole new thing. But for the third category, the one that Nick was talking about there, you could imagine like a revenue share for reuse type model, right, amongst a pool of people. So you say, hey, look, we're all verifying things, we're all relying on things, and we all broadly trust each other. And so with a clearinghouse that could be implemented as a central body, or it could be done with smart contracts on a blockchain, something like that, you could imagine where the person who contributes data to the network is rewarded a percentage of the costs whenever that is reused by someone who then consumes that on a network. And that's without creating some big silo where the data itself lives. That's by attaching special cryptography to the credentials themselves that require that payment before it can be verified. So that's a kind of business model that we haven't seen outside of like closed consortia before. But I think we are on the cusp of being able to see these kind of more open loop business models, which will be really exciting when they do start coming up. Yeah,
agreed. Yeah, and really interesting topic. I'm going to skip a couple of questions. I think we've got probably time for a couple more, because the answers have been really good and nice and full. In terms of one of the big things that we see with, I guess, new systems, and that everyone is away working on their own solutions. I think not invented here syndrome certainly seems to exist in the identity space, and it's trying to make all of this stuff work together. And so obviously we can lean on things like standards to make that happen. So an agreed set of kind of rules and parameters that maybe people building this technology can work toward to ensure that it all works. But what do companies need? I mean, how important do you see interoperability, for example, Emma, and why do companies need this interoperability?
I think it's really important to have interoperability. I think it's one of those things that is needed because what it will do is will drive more value from the identities themselves. It will drive more user adoption. It's one of those things that is, has to be underpinned by standards, but it is really challenging to get kind of like interoperability to work. Wouldn't it be great if I could use my digital ID and I relocated to another country and I didn't have to go through all of the rigmarole to opening a bank account, to getting access to government services? I could just do that really simply and digitally. And just trying to get those kind of use cases to work is really challenging because, when you think about you've obviously got different ecosystems, but you've also got different countries. And when we look at things like the EU, they're doing a lot to try and create, European frameworks that will allow that interoperability. It's long, slow progress, but it's much needed, because in my opinion, like that's what will drive, from a user perspective, just more adoption and more value.
Nick or James, I mean, we kind of hear at Doc a lot about kind of vendors not wanting to be locked into any one solution as being a reason for promoting interoperability. What are you guys seeing in the marketplace?
Yeah, I mean, there definitely is an element of that, right? There's a reticence to make the investment because a lot of the companies providing these solutions are relatively small, or the standards themselves are relatively nascent, and they're evolving very quickly, and it's very hard to keep track of. So, no one wants to feel like they are making a big bet on some tiny unproven thing, whether that's a standard or a company. And so either that leads to people just sort of waiting and insisting that they're not really going to do anything until interoperability is sort of proven, or they can adopt kind of a standards agility mindset and basically accept that, there are a bunch of very motivated people working on the lower levels of the stack, like the minutiae there. And, as long as you work with a vendor that can speak to the relevant ecosystems that you care about, that's probably good enough. Most people implementing this stuff, unless you are a government, don't really need to worry about that. They just need to worry, what standards do my future partners speak? What ecosystems do I need to interoperate with? And, as Emma said, if I'm in the EU, that question has been answered for me. That there's a whole reference framework I can go read that tells me that. If I'm trying to create something for my industry, then maybe I need to sit together with a group of motivated folks and actually say, well, look, what properties do we care about? And that's where you make the trade-offs around, cryptographic maturity and privacy technologies and so on and so forth, to actually hone in on what you really need. But, today, that question should be below the waterline for like 80% of folks who are looking at this stuff, because the standards are much less of a moving target than they ever used to be.
One thing just to add, James, to that point about you've got the different layers of interoperability, right? The business layer of business utility and organizations coming together around that also has the benefit of social proof that other organizations are moving and they're getting involved, which you would assume and hope speeds up the momentum.
Good point, Nick. Okay, interoperability covered. So we had a lot more questions lined up, but just I thought things might go a little bit this way, so we haven't quite covered them all. But I thought a really good thing to finish off on before we can try and pick off some audience questions is advice to people listening into this podcast in terms of, or this panel, sorry, in terms of like practical things that they can take away if they're thinking about trying to figure out, maybe with someone's help, they maybe have a project or a problem that they're trying to solve, and they're trying to figure out what can they use to solve it. Is decentralized identity the answer? How do they go about assessing that specific question? What should they be asking vendors before they start working with them? And Nick, if we could start with you, please.
My initial thought on this is don't sweat the tech. And I don't mean that to belittle or undermine the importance of the tech. I mean that there are other things to be considered. So to the extent that your provider or decentralized identity platform can abstract a lot of the complexity and that you believe that they can adapt to the changing landscape from a low-lying standards and tech point of view, and that they have the aptitude to do that, just go for it, right? And I think retain and understand that your bigger challenge, and Emma mentioned it earlier actually about digital identity being sexy. Like there's always a small number of people within an organization who have had the foresight or the time to really understand this. And they similarly think we've reinvented fire, like this is amazing. That second order comms problem of how to prioritize this endeavor within the business cannot be underestimated, how challenging it is to make sure that this gets the right prioritization within a business who has a bunch of other things going on. So understanding that, really focus on business value and consumer value, focus on how a move in decentralized identity can help address regulation, how it can address the threat of AI, how it can have the triple whammy and also help empower individuals and consumers and actually change the way an individual thinks about the relationship with that organization. An empowering relationship will increase sentiment, will get better NPS scores, will end up in better relationships with your customers. So it's a long way of saying get started now.
Ever the sales guy, Nick. That was good.
Can't help myself, Nick.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you. Thanks for good answer though. Emma, do you want to pick at that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is so important to really focus on the value, because it is really easy, and Nick and James and I probably, I've met people inside of organizations and they get really evangelical about the technology and they get really sold on digital identity inside their own organization. And then you talk to them and then they're like, I can't get anyone else to see this vision. Because they've kind of, they've fallen in love with the technology versus actually going, how do I make the business case internally? And that's where the rubber really hits the road. And you're never going to get an exec excited about a particular type of technology. That's just not going to happen. What you will get them excited about, to Nick's point, is a business case. And I think that's really where you have to focus. And it is hard, because, if you're working inside a bank, and, you've got all of this other regulation, you've got all this other stuff and all these other fires going on. How do you get someone at an executive level to really take notice of something that is the future? That if you don't do it, and I'm absolutely passionate about digital identity as the future. If you don't do it, then actually you're not going to have a business. Your business is going to be fundamentally different in the future and for the worse. So I think it's starting with the business case, forgetting a bit about the sexiness and the digital identity piece of it and just really focusing on the business case and then getting started there. I think that's the most important thing to do.
That's exactly it. The only thing I would add is there's also an opportunity to show, don't tell, right? Like we don't need to teach people about the tech, but we also don't need to hypothesize about user experiences either. Like there are vendors out there now with like really good rapid prototyping tools, right? You don't have to write a lot of code. You don't have to integrate this into back. You don't have to use real data even. You can do demos in the conference room of what this might look like. And you can show like, here's what our checkout process looks like now, 3 pages, 20 pieces of information, and it takes on average 45 seconds with a 30% drop off, blah, blah, blah. And you can show what that would look like if in one click you could share the information from a wallet. And yeah, you've done a bit of magic behind the scenes, but the point is that is incredibly powerful, and you can do it with the real tech. This doesn't have to be a Figma prototype. Like all that stuff exists now, where again it didn't exist or was really, really, really ugly just a few years ago. So everything you guys said, but also just consider showing, not telling as well.
Awesome. Thank you, James. So it's a quick bit of time for some audience questions. It would be remiss not to pick up something from Justin because he's been extremely involved. So I think, Justin, it's only fair that we have a question from you. So Justin's question is, and open this up to anyone, do you foresee companies having a bring your own identity or decentralized identity policy, I guess equivalent to having kind of bring your own device policy that you see in many orgs today? Sorry, it's in relation for forestalling multi-factor authentication or 2FA.
I'll have a go. I think... I mean, look, the short answer is no, not anytime soon, right? I mean, because yes, you can bring your own device, but usually it's only if it's in organizations that even have a policy about this, the ISO 27001, whatever. It's going to be a device that's like really locked down, and you can only use this subset of apps, and everything phones home, and so. Is it really your device at that point? I mean, I don't know about you. It gives me the GBs whenever I'm asked to install those policies. So I don't think we're going to see that with identities either. I think that organizations, in order to meet their very real obligations to their customers, to their regulators, in many cases, are just going to need to control that sort of stuff. So they'll never be like fully self-sovereign in a kind of show up with your own identity, provide some kind of proof of who you are, right? They're going to need to onboard you through a human resources process. Now, that might involve showing up with your government issued digital ID or with a reusable ID from one of these IDV vendors that is in the process of credentializing their work and things like that. It'll have aspects of what we've been talking about in it during the onboarding process. And yeah, maybe when you sign into devices, instead of having goodness knows how many different tokens and logins and things like that, maybe you'll be able to store those credentials in the same digital wallet that is, either your third party one or your government issued one. I can imagine that future, like, completely. And maybe that's what you meant, Justin. So if so, then I retract my previous statement. It's 2 thumbs up. But if we meant it like literally, like you could share it with your own YubiKey key. A lot of companies just aren't going to be ready for that anytime soon. Would be my view.
You're shaking your head. I think you're agreeing.
Yeah, I totally agree. Totally agree. I'm totally agreeing. I'm like, I just can't. I mean, got some, good friends that work in, some of the really big kind of multinational organizations, who are fighting kind of like, threat vectors and attacks every day. I just can't see it. Can't see it, because they're like, everything's under attack all of the time. I think just, bringing something from the outside in, maybe something going from the inside out might happen, but I can't see anyone bringing their own identity in.
Keep a lockdown. You seeing it the same way, Nick?
Yeah, fully agreed.
Do you know, actually, I'm gonna volunteer. I know we want to get through another question, but the one exception to this might be for business due diligence, where we are seeing like reusable IDs in a B2B context starting to gain traction. And again, it's not quite bring your own, but it is worth paying attention to. So Justin, maybe you know about this, maybe you don't, but go and have a look at things like LEIs and verifiable LEIs that are a way that businesses and their employees can prove that they have a certain role at a certain company when interacting with other businesses. It's quite early, but it's really promising and might point in the direction that you were going.
Thank you, James. Last question, if we can have some quick answers to this one, that'd be great. So question from Stefan. Stefan, thanks for the question. Business ID is becoming more critical due to impersonation and easy access to public records of a business. What should businesses be doing to first protect themselves and their identity? Nick, can I start with you on that one, please?
I'm going to chuck that at James. He can continue riffing on his LEI, on his LEI piece.
Yeah, I suppose that did segue rather beautifully, didn't it? It's a simple fact that a lot of business information does exist in these systems of record, right? These public registries, and so Stefan's point is exactly right. It's just as hard to prove that you represent a business as it is to prove that you are an individual, only multiplied by 10, because businesses have multiple entities and they have directors and they have shareholders and so on and so forth. So doing like proper corporate due diligence is an absolute nightmare. It's a very, very difficult digital identity problem. And it's compounded by the fact that a lot of that information is publicly available, so it doesn't even have to be breached. You just go look it up. So it's not enough to know the registered office address and the name of 3 directors or whatever. That's all a matter of public record. And so what do you do? Well, you can prove that you are one of the individuals that has a certain authority to act on behalf of that business. That would be amazing, right? And so there are a few different approaches, and we mentioned LEIs and the work that Glyph and others are doing a couple of minutes ago. That's one such initiative where the idea is to take a registry of unique, like globally unique business identifiers, but actually equip the individuals with cryptographic tools to prove that they represent that business. And so then, as long as the business had good internal governance over who had those tools, then you would never have the question of, well, actually, how do I know that Emma really works for CAF, and how do I know that Nick can really sign contracts on behalf of Mission? It would be a mathematical certainty. It's a really promising tech. But if you're getting deja vu from the conversation we had 20 minutes ago about how we mustn't be enamored by the tech because that's like really, really promising, but actually you've got to adopt it. The same thing applies here, but guess what? 10 times. Okay, because it's going to be 10 times more complicated. The one thing it might have going for it is it doesn't touch sensitive personal data as much as doing individual ID, and so it might be more palatable both for the individuals themselves and for regulators. And the cost of fraud against businesses is orders of magnitude higher than the cost of fraud against individuals, and so the carrot in terms of potential cost savings is also really big. So we may see this move even quicker than the stuff for individuals.
Mm-hmm.
Great point. It seems like a really nice place to end. We've kind of run out of time, but I really enjoyed the discussion. Emma, Nick, James, thank you very much for your time and for joining us. And to everyone who either watched now or is going to watch on demand, hopefully it was a good session. You got a good understanding of decentralized identity technology, a fairly kind of superficial but hopefully meaningful level. And we talked about some of the use cases and some of the kind of good things for adoption and maybe some of the pitfalls as well. So hope you got something out of it. So with that, we'll leave it there. Thank you everyone for joining.
Thanks a lot, Nick.
Thanks so much.
Nick.
Cheers.